Hello, and thank you all for joining us today for this next episode of EnergySource Innovation Stream. We're so excited to have you all call in from all over the world. My name is Reed Blakemore, Acting Director of the Atlantic Council Global Energy Center. I'm joined today by Thomas Cavett, Chief of Staff and Vice President of Strategy and Operations at Tomorrow.io, a company that's developed an exciting new methodology for predictive weather modeling using artificial intelligence and advanced satellites. Tomorrow.io's technology is already used across industries like aviation, cloud providers, and, as we'll be discussing today, the energy sector. Record temperatures in Europe, the United States, and South Asia underscore the importance of developing technology to understand and respond to increasingly volatile climate realities. In that regard, Tomorrow.io is on the cutting edge. Before I jump in, just a few reminders for our audience. First, you can follow us on Twitter at AC Global Energy and use the hashtag HGEnergy. We're on the record and currently live streaming on YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook. And we encourage you to share and post about what you hear today. Those in the virtual audience can submit questions through the Q&A function on Zoom, and we'll try to get to as many of these as we can. If you're watching on another platform like YouTube, unfortunately, we can't take your questions, but I would encourage you to register and join the Zoom session so we can get those questions in. With that, I'd like to give the floor to Thomas for his presentation. Thomas, over to you.
Great. Thanks, Reed. Let me just share my screen here. And Reed, let me know when you can see this.
Yep, we can see it.
Great. All right. So hi, everyone. My name is Thomas Cavett, as Reed said, and I work for a company called Tomorrow.io. We are a weather and climate security platform powered by something we call weather intelligence, which I'll explain a bit what that means. So, hold on. Let me share the next slide. Okay. So, kind of before we dive in, let's start with the broader context, right? And the issues that I think we all have kind of a front row seat into on a daily basis. Right, climate change obviously is driving worse and worse weather. Right, more volatile, more extreme weather events on a more frequent basis. Over the last few years, we've seen $210 billion in damages in 2020. Extremely quickly growing costs around fires, disruptions to energy grids, hurricanes, record years year after year. And the projections are that this is only going to get worse, right? When we see, 3.1 million days of operations could be lost from an economic output standpoint, that's pretty significant. Projected to see billions and billions in damages from floods this year. We've already seen quite a few flooding events. And this is really a multi-trillion-dollar problem over the next, decade or so. We've seen consensus growing, not just on the government side, but from private sector businesses as well, where leaders are starting to realize that this is a real problem and it's going to impact their operations more and more. And when we see the same trend growing in the energy sector, right? When you look at weather-related power outages, these are continuing to grow. It's a very similar trend to what you saw on the graph before. Obviously, the disruptions are significant. An interesting statistic is that the cost of damages and the lost revenue projected from these weather-related disruptions to the utility sector is projected to grow by 23% or more. That's a pretty conservative estimate based on some historical data, but we all know that with the increasing volatility we're seeing, historical data is not as reliable as it once was. We can't really assume the same trends going forward. Another interesting survey looks at, what are the kind of the biggest concerns that these private sector business leaders are looking at? And this is not just the energy sector, right? But thinking about the operational impact of all of these different climate disasters is really front and center. And one of the biggest challenges is that we have this data that says things are going to get worse, but we don't necessarily have the right tools to make the right decisions and address these issues when they're happening in real time. And so Tomorrow.io was really founded around that exact kind of concept. We were started in 2016. We're a global company based in the US. Our headquarters is in Boston. We've raised over $200 million to date. And you can see, we really work with a very broad variety of customers, like Reed mentioned, everything from airlines to energy production companies, utilities, delivery companies, restaurants, various US government agencies. And really what this speaks to is the fact that all of these different sectors are waking up to this reality that weather impacts their daily operations, and they need a tool to help them address it, day to day on a day-to-day basis. We're about 180 employees, but we have over 100 in R&D. We're really focused on tech and kind of the underlying science of the weather industry, which I'll get into here in a few minutes. Just a quick kind of high level view, because I know a lot of the folks here are focused on kind of the federal government and policy standpoint. So we work pretty extensively with the US Air Force. They're actually funding the development and launch of a few of our satellites, a piece of our constellation. We're the chief architect for NOAA's EPIC program. So this is an effort to migrate NOAA's numerical weather prediction, all of their weather forecasting software into the cloud to modernize it and make it more open source. We're kind of the industry leading experts in this area. And so they've asked us to be the chief architect under Raytheon for that program. We work on urban air mobility programs with NASA, modeling weather in complex urban environments. And we're also very closely tied with the National Weather Service as well. So just a few snapshots of kind of what we do with the federal government. So when we take a step back and look at the problem, right? The problem is obviously what we saw before. The climate impact is growing, right? But the problem is most of the climate mitigation offerings that we see today are really focused on decades in the future. How should you invest for your asset portfolio? How should you think about your strategy in 2030, 2040, 2050? And what are the impacts going to be? The problem is the extreme weather is happening right now, right? And that doesn't really help you solve the infrastructure problem that you have. You can't necessarily build a seawall in the next few days. You can't necessarily reposition your grid or put your power lines underground. Those are long-term projects that take a long time to implement. The other issue is that much of the world is actually blind to weather data. So when we think about kind of the core infrastructure of how we observe the Earth's atmosphere, one of the most important elements of this is ground-based radar systems. So you can see this map in the lower left-hand corner. We have NEXRAD here in the United States, Western Europe, Japan, a few other countries have similar, dense systems. Even those have some gaps. But the problem is weather and the Earth's atmosphere is happening globally, right? And so the inability to see, sort of in real time what's happening over the oceans or over other continents around the world actually impacts our ability to forecast good weather right here in the United States. And the third piece is really that the weather forecast itself really hasn't evolved. We've been writing the same kind of format and style of a forecast for a century or more, telling someone, here's the probability of a weather event or these weather parameters. If you're not a meteorologist, you're not an atmospheric scientist, sometimes that can be a bit abstract and difficult to make the right decisions. So kind of against that backdrop, right, where we see, costs are growing, it's difficult to link sort of the forecast and what's happening in the weather to the impact on your business. A lot of the industry has traditionally focused on meteorologists providing a service on top of the information to help you interpret that, but it's really not scalable, right? If you've got an enormous organization, let's say 100,000 people, you can't all call the few meteorologists on your staff to help you make better decisions. And so that's really how we've approached it. We're a SaaS platform, a software as a service platform. It's called the Weather and Climate Security Platform. And it's all about helping our users make better decisions based on the weather that's happening to the locations or the assets that they care about. Again, from a deep tech standpoint, we run our own in-house numerical weather prediction and nowcasting models, as well as a bunch of other data layers. We don't just sort of take the government models that NOAA and other government agencies around the world put out and regurgitate them. What this allows us to do is really innovate on the resolution and the ability to add additional observations, for example, to make those more accurate and more flexible for our customers. The other thing that we do that's unique is we have a single platform for all of the industries we serve. So rather than building different products for each industry, it allows us to really invest in that single platform and really build a lot of features and functionality that's useful. And then lastly, we're addressing this global coverage gap. So we're launching a constellation of satellites. I'll tell you a little bit more of that here in a second, but it's really all about kind of democratizing that access to weather and creating really a step change in our ability to observe the Earth's atmosphere, which we haven't seen before. And so this is kind of to give you a bigger picture of how this value chain works and why it's so important, because I think the science behind all of this is really key to understanding the weather industry itself. The observations themselves are obviously important. If you have too few observations, you really don't understand what's happening in a certain part of the world. You're sort of inferring the weather there in that area. And even if you put, let's say, a supercomputer on top of a weather model and you crank up the resolution, if you don't proportionally increase your observational density, you're not going to get really a useful output. You're just higher resolution, wrong. And in theory, all models are wrong, right? What we also have been able to do is build all of these other data layers, whether that's lightning flash rate density or fire hazard and smoke, which, are not necessarily something that the government has put out on a scale that's useful for private industry. But most importantly, we put all of that into this single source of truth, which allows, a non-meteorologist, really a lay user, to build these workflows, build these decision-making systems to help them make, better decisions for their business. And so what this looks like in practice is, a very nice user interface, but most importantly, what it does is it allows you to focus in on the things that matter, right? And so if you look at the timeline on the bottom of this screenshot from our platform, it might say, if you're an agricultural, company, when should you spray? When should you irrigate? When is the optimal time to do that so that you have, better crop yield, better outputs, but also you're not harming the environment by overspraying and having it wash away into the lands around your farm or something along those lines. So really kind of focus on the decision that the user needs to make in a very predictive way, allowing you to plan ahead, up to 2 weeks in advance, and really monitor and understand what to do with those assets at a large scale. And so when we look at specific use cases from some of our energy customers, IndiGrid, major utility provider in India, during the 2020 cyclone Amphan, they were hit by pretty large storm. And what our platform was able to do is say, look, these are the 3 stations that you need to position your crews because they're at the highest risk of damage and potentially causing an outage. And they did that. And they were actually able to prevent pretty significant outages across a really large service area, and save them, not only keeping power on for, all of their customers, but also millions in costs, and also preserve revenue as well, that they were able to do just from using our platform and understanding of what are the things I need to worry about. The alternative would have been, I see this enormous map and this storm of, approaching this service area. I need to make sort of value judgments based on experience of where I need to put crews, and it wouldn't have been as precise and effective. And so when we think about, kind of the broader industry, obviously outage predictions are really important, emergency preparedness, like the example you just saw, but also protecting crews, protecting assets, when they need to deploy a maintenance crew or keep them back at their headquarters to keep them safe from some weather event. When we think about renewables and the need to build more and more of this infrastructure to meet some of our sort of carbon goals over the next few decades, there are a number of inputs that are required from that, right? Whether that's using weather data to understand the exact area that you need to build to optimally, sort of build the right asset, whether that's a wind farm over the ocean or a solar farm somewhere on land. But also when to actually perform the construction itself, right? There are significant costs associated with, renting the crane or booking the boats to get out to, the asset you're building over the ocean. Also operations and maintenance, right? When you think about, should I put this worker on the wind turbine because of lightning in the region? When is the right time to do that, to get that maintenance done and keep that crew safe? So lots of different applications here that you can enable through a platform like this that are really impactful. And just taking one quick last step back. So when we think about, this idea that weather data is not universal, I think it surprises many people who are not familiar with this industry. It's actually quite shocking when you see sort of the disparity and the inequality that we've created in our ability to observe, the atmosphere. Essentially 5 billion people around the world live outside of radar coverage. Radar is how we see precipitation, which is one of the most important variables in weather forecasting. And NOAA and other agencies have consistently said, look, this is the biggest problem that we face. And building this kind of infrastructure, building ground-based radar systems is really not a scalable solution. Building it all over the world would cost, hundreds of billions of dollars, not to mention just the operating costs to maintain them. And so the only way to really do this effectively is from space. And so that's exactly what we've set out to do. So we're actually building a constellation of radars as well as microwave sounders, two different types of instruments that are very complementary. And we'll be launching the first of those in the first quarter of next year. And the applications of this are pretty significant, right? It's not just, sort of industry specific, whether we're looking at routes for aircraft over the oceans, better understanding of data to build energy infrastructure, to maintain it, but also specific applications, right? Like flooding, early warning systems for the developing world. They're just sort of endless impacts of having better weather data on a more frequent basis from a precipitation standpoint, temperature and water vapor, which are all things that this constellation will see. And I think that's it. So I went 1 minute over my 15 minutes. So happy to turn it back over to Reed to go into questions.
Thomas, it was 1 minute over, but a minute well spent, I'd say, because it's hugely interesting stuff. I want to remind our audience before I dive into my own questions, of which I have several, that if you'd like to submit questions, you can use the Q&A function on Zoom to get those in. But I think to start, Thomas, you mentioned the various use cases that we can, that are new opportunities as a result of this technology. And the utility side is actually one that's particularly interesting to me. Obviously in a high inflationary environment where we have lots of energy security concerns, right, we're beginning to look more and more at the demand side and what that means for energy efficiency and grid optimization. What role can a technology like Tomorrow.io and predictive weather technology play in driving down those energy costs and ensuring the efficient use of electricity generation and transmission?
Yeah, so I think especially as you start to see more diversified grids, right, where we've got maybe coal, we've got wind and solar and all of these different assets that are producing. The ability to understand, okay, where is my service area going to be impacted? Where is the demand going to be? But also, how are those energy sources going to be impacted, right? How well can I produce wind or solar, or do I need to shift to my, coal asset? Understanding both of those sort of variables in real time is, I think, how we can provide, benefit, right? Through an API, through the sort of access to this real-time data, you're able to understand, what's happening, where do I need to shift those resources around?
And does that speak to, I guess, ultimately Tomorrow.io, like having some sort of grid integration, I suppose, with the utilities themselves? Like, can you use a partnership or a pairing with an energy storage hub to, really predict those peak generation and load times and immediately shift those resources? Is that kind of a partnership, your model you're already trying to deploy, or is that something kind of over the horizon?
It is. No, it's something we're already working to deploy. Mm-hmm. It's something that, there are numerous applications of weather in this industry, right? Yeah. And one of the biggest is, there are sort of unique variables like solar irradiance, right? That for the most part, that's a solar, PV sort of specific thing that people care about, right? And so the ability to model that and provide that in, the resolution that's needed is really key. But then, automating that into the system, I think, is the next step.
Mm-hmm. So what does that automation ultimately look like, I guess, is the question I'm driving for. Is that an adaptation of the API into the utility software? Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, you can have the human in the loop, right? You can have sort of the operations center that's reading the information in real time, but I think the ideal state is that it's automated, right? And it's an API directly into the systems that are managing the production.
Mm-hmm. I guess pivoting a little bit, right? I mean, we talked about these, resiliency issues, and one of the things I found fascinating that dovetails off a question we have from the audience, from Mark in the audience, is, you mentioned optimal irrigation patterns, optimizing those things to, improve agricultural resilience. One of the things I, feel very strongly about as a native Californian, where you have all of these wildfires, is particularly, how these now more extreme weather patterns are increasing the level of risk to both, forestry and also the timber industry. So I didn't notice, a big part of the timber industry represented on those initial partnerships, but have you begun to reach out there as well?
We haven't, we've talked about that as a use case. We haven't had any that have reached out to us proactively, but I think it's definitely something that we could provide, value to.
And then kind of pivoting once more, you mentioned that there's a democratization of weather data that's happening, that needs to happen. And that's kind of the next big phase for tomorrow.io as you launch this global network of satellites. It does make me think about this issue of, environmental and energy justice, right? And improving resilience, both with individuals, but also at a community level. For individuals or smaller communities, not necessarily business partnerships, what is tomorrow.io's vision for allowing access to these tools, and what role could the software play in places like Tornado Alley, or more hurricane-prone parts of the world, where fundamentally the visibility into these weather patterns is significantly smaller than it is here in Washington D.C., for example.
Yeah, for sure. So I guess three things that I'll say. So one is we have a consumer app that we push the same weather information into. So that's anybody could download that. The second is we work really closely, like I mentioned, with NOAA and other government agencies. And the intent there is, one, we work really heavily with them to drive the science forward. So when our radar constellation is on orbit, that's a data set that's never existed before. So no one actually really has the fully developed tools to assimilate and properly use that data. Mm-hmm. But then more importantly, I think it's one, we're a private business, so we have to protect our ability to sell, right, to the industry and to consumers. But when it comes to these sort of bigger kind of emergency situations and extreme weather events, we're totally open with, working with the government to figure out how to share that, mm-hmm. And make sure it gets into the right hands. Another great example is heat waves, right, that we're experiencing right now. Actually our CEO spoke in front of Congress last summer about ways to sort of drive that information to the right people so they're making the right decisions, and protecting lives, right? Mm-hmm. The last piece is we actually have a nonprofit that we founded last year, which is primarily focused on Africa, but it's about bringing the technology and the tools that we develop to those underdeveloped parts of the world that don't have these early warning systems, that are disproportionately impacted because their infrastructure is poor, right? By these extreme weather events. So we're very heavily invested in that and kind of bringing this information to the rest of the world.
Mm-hmm. I think we have a really good question from Lee from our audience, which I want to touch on, because I think it would ground some of these use cases we've talked about really, really strongly. I think, a couple of years ago, obviously we had this incredible winter weather disaster in Texas, right? Where as a result of, extreme weather patterns, which is the core of what you're trying to do, you had, people without power, for prolonged periods of time, purely because the grid and the associated energy infrastructure was unable to manage it. If we take tomorrow.io and put it in that situation a few years ago, what would you have been able to do in terms of advising the energy companies and regulatory bodies in Texas? How would you have gone about offering that advice during the emergency period itself? And, how would have those recipients used that actual advice in practice?
Yeah, so I can probably answer the first part more than the second. I think we actually looked at our platform after that event in Texas, and we said, okay, if they had used this, would they have been able to see, better information? Would they have been able to potentially make a better decision? Because we can't necessarily influence the actual decision itself. And the answer was yes, right? I think a big part of that disaster was caused by the fact that, the weather information, the temperature forecasts that they were looking at were not necessarily as accurate as they needed to be. And so they underproduced, right? And so the demand was significantly higher than what was available from an energy production standpoint. And so, I think that the way that we could have integrated is to say, here are the areas that are going to be particularly hit, better enable whatever sort of analytics platform and models that they're running on their side to predict that demand and help them make kind of a better production decision. Mm-hmm. The other piece of it is more on the government side, right? From an emergency management standpoint and emergency response standpoint, where are people going to be, hit the hardest, and what resources do you need to deploy in order to, maybe it's move them into an emergency shelter to keep them warm or whatever it might be. So there's this other sort of piece of it, which it's not just, sort of the top of the funnel here, but it's also kind of the end state, like what happens after the disaster and how do you manage it, or during it.
Very cool. I think, yeah, the questions are now coming in fast and loose right now, which is going to pivot again. We have a question from Benjamin. Speaks a little bit to, your renewables deployment use case that you mentioned in terms of being able to determine, hey, optimal times to, reach out for those permits and get those renewables in the ground. But I think also a little bit on the forecasting and how far out can you do that forecasting in terms of being able perhaps to say, certain renewable use cases, like for example, solar in a particular location might be less effective over the long term due to longer term climate change impacts or things like that. Can your platform be used for that type of stuff? If not necessarily now, possibly, in a few years' time.
Yeah. So, there's weather forecasting and climate forecasting are two very different animals, right? The science is fundamentally different. Numerical weather prediction, which is full physics atmospheric modeling of the Earth's atmosphere, right, is really out to 14 days is the limit, just from a scientific standpoint. Beyond that, you start to get into what we would call kind of subseasonal, seasonal, and then kind of more climatological forecasting. It is very, very different, and we don't do that type of work. That's other companies. Now, yeah, in the future, could we? Sure. I will say we, as a company, kind of believe that the science is very different, and the ability to kind of reliably forecast at the level of precision you would need, right, for a decision like that, where you're going to say, I'm going to build this, this array of solar panels in this specific geography. It becomes a bit more of a guessing game than what we can say within the next 2 weeks is really reliably going to happen.
Fair enough. We're running out of time, and I have one more question that I want to ask and take moderator's prerogative on before I turn to you for some last big remarks. But in a way, when you're talking about these community resilience and these disaster response sort of initiatives that Tomorrow.io can contribute to, there is a level of, the resiliency of your own platform, particularly, your own satellite platforms. That in my mind is a question around cybersecurity in some ways. How do you think of things through keeping your network safe, keeping it resilient, and so it can provide those emergency services when needed?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, from a cybersecurity standpoint, look, we try to follow kind of best practices. We obviously work with the U.S. federal government, so we're held to a pretty high standard. The other benefit, which is differentiated from, NASA operates a radar satellite called GPM, for example. It's a single satellite in low Earth orbit, and a single point of failure is obviously a much higher risk than an entire constellation. So for us, if we have a constellation of a few dozen satellites and one goes out, what we lose is a few minutes on our revisit rate, right? It's not as significant of an impact to kind of the data that we're able to provide. But yeah, absolutely, from a cyber standpoint, that's a big focus.
We're running out of time. I want to leave you with one last question, which is really what's next for you guys. As you look out, obviously this is a hugely significant technology. You guys are developing the partnerships and use cases that are incredibly relevant, both to the energy transition, but also to, dealing and mitigating the consequences of climate change. As you look out over the next, several years, what's the net beyond it? You already kind of touched on this with the satellite deployment piece, but beyond that, even kind of what is over the horizon? What are you looking forward to?
Yeah, so we will continue to look at other kind of novel ways to innovate, both on the observational side, right, whether that's in space or not. The modeling side and driving the science forward. And I think the biggest thing, and just to reiterate, the impact of what we're building in space is significant. I mentioned GPM, which is this single radar satellite in low Earth orbit. The revisit rate of that satellite is every 3 days, right? And what that means is, from an operational forecasting standpoint, its data is essentially irrelevant, right? You're running a model every few hours or even in minutes in some cases. You can't really assimilate that data and provide anything valuable out of it. And so our constellation reduces that from 3 days down to an hour for the entire globe on average, which that step change alone is going to unlock insights that we've never seen before. We don't have that picture holistically of the entire globe from a precipitation standpoint when we look at convective storms, but also climate science, right? We're leveraging weather observations and weather modeling data to inform what the climate forecast says. And so by having a much more accurate picture of what's happening right now, we're going to have even better forecasts into climate in the future. So we can sort of hypothesize like what all the impacts of that will be, but they're going to be significant, right?
You don't need to hypothesize terribly much to determine how significant they actually are. And so I think this is a remarkable technology and such a profound opportunity, both again on the energy company and grid optimization side, but also on the community resiliency and ensuring that the impacts of climate change are as limited as possible to what was ultimately human lives when you get down to it. So that wraps up, unfortunately, it wraps up our time for the day. But I just want to thank everyone who tuned in. I want to thank Thomas for your time and your insights into this fascinating technology. I also want to thank everybody here at the Atlantic Council who helped put this event together, including Amaya Hadap, Dan Stillman, Lloyd Ritter, and Rebecca Meechan-Nance. We'll definitely be keeping up with you, Thomas, and Tomorrow.io's technology going forward. And if you'd like to rewatch this event, a cached replay will be available on the Atlantic Council Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. And we encourage you, as always, to share this with your colleagues and friends, because the more awareness around this stuff just advances the weather democratization ideas that you're talking about, Thomas. So that's all for now. Thank you for joining us. Have a great rest of your week. And until next time, this has been Atlantic Council Innovation Stream.